Could someone in the back turn off the other lights so that we can see the screen more fully? And those of you that are in the way back row, I moved all the rows back a little bit so, any kind of spittle that might come off of me won't reach the first table. But since we're going to be talking about stuff that's up here, with only 20 of you in the class and 30 seats, there's no, please, you don't have to get up now, but in the future sit more closely. And those of you that are using computers, come and talk to me about why you're using a computer and not taking notes by hand, okay? Because as we mentioned the first day of class, taking notes by hand is a much more effective way to learn. And this has been proven, psychological studies. And the Marymount student handbook says no electronic devices in class unless I tell you to, okay? So those of you with cell phones, remember that I've kind of got a zero tolerance policy about that. All right? So I don't mind you using a computer to take notes. I just don't think it's a really good idea, and scientists will back me up on this, right? So we left off talking about Giotto a week ago, right? It seems like this is such a stutter start to the semester with the snow and everything. And we were talking about the Giotto's new interest in three-dimensional works, right? Making the figures in the paintings seem more three-dimensional rather than flat on the surface, right? Rather than more artificial looking. They become much more realistic around the year 1300, a little bit before that, right? And a week ago, we talked about some of the factors that might have inspired Giotto to do this, right? Certain things that were changing in society, both within religion and within the social structure that, the people who were buying works of art, that might have actually come into play in affecting Giotto's change in style, right? And that this new interest in three-dimensionality comes from Giotto's renewed interest in ancient Roman art. And so the term that's used for this is the Renaissance, the rebirth of ancient Rome, beginning around 1300, in literature and in art, right? We find it as well in civics, right? Roman ideal of civic duty is also reborn, as well as Roman forms of poetry, literature, and of course art. It's a concentrated, interconnected revival of interest in ancient Rome, right? And for Giotto, of course, what he's getting from ancient Rome is this modeling in three dimensions, using light and dark. And the term we use, chiaroscuro, for that, right? Which literally means in Latin, Italian, light, dark, right? Chiaro, scuro. Chiaro, light, scuro, dark, right? And we were connecting this again to society in Florence, where Giotto's home base was. He was working in the city of Florence. And through the 14th and the 15th centuries, the 1300s and the 1400s, Florence is the center of the Renaissance. There are other centers as well, but Florence is by far the most important. And the vast majority of artists that we'll look at in the first week and a half of class, Italian artists at least, are based in Florence. Right? Rome doesn't enter into the picture yet as a base for the Renaissance, not until the 1500s, the 16th century, right? So Giotto's in Florence, although he becomes very, very popular, right? This new style really hits. And in fact, we have records of Giotto having done commissions for about 6 or 7 other cities, right? Patrons in other cities, all over Europe, or actually all over Italy, right? So he's really resonating with the patrons. And we have to keep in mind something about art in the 13th, 14th century that's different from today, is that painters aren't just making paintings and hoping somebody's going to buy them, right? This is a commission-based trade, right? Giotto's not making stock to keep around the house and hoping someone will beat their way to his door. What Giotto is doing is he's working on commission. Right? It's like an architect, right? Architects don't build things and hope people will buy them. They build things because people pay them up front and tell them what they want. Right? That's what painting was like, really, for the most part, up until around the 17th century, until the 1600s, where we start to get artists working for the open market and what we think of today as art being more free, right? Artistic expression and whatnot, being a personal choice. Giotto had some of that, but everything in the painting was planned ahead of time, and there would have been a contract between Giotto and the patron. This is what I want. This is what I'll pay you. This is what, and with what I want, they'll talk about materials. They'll talk about subject matter, right? Giotto's not choosing to paint the Virgin and Child. Somebody's saying that's what I want, right? And in this case, it's a church in Florence, right? Has commissioned this from Giotto. Now, many of our contracts don't survive, but where they do, they're really fascinating, right? They really give us a lot of insight into this very different way of making art than what we're used to today, okay? We wound up looking at another artist from exactly the same time period, Duccio, who was working next door in Siena. And Siena, the city of Siena, has a very similar social structure to Florence. It's filled with this new merchant class, right? And so their interests that drove Giotto's Renaissance style also seem to drive Duccio's Renaissance style, right? Again, new forms of religious devotion we talked about with the Franciscans and the Dominicans, the mendicant orders, but also this new merchant class that really wants a more realistic kind of art. So Duccio also uses chiaroscuro. Look at the figures in the foreground, for example, the man in pink on the left, to give us the sense of fully three-dimensional figures, right? Now, his style and Giotto's style aren't exactly mirrors of each other, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. There's something personal about Giotto's style. There's something personal about Duccio's style. But each of them is adopting this, adopting this earlier Roman three-dimensionality into their works. Right? And so as we were looking at this in the class, we were talking about the fact that this was dismembered from a larger work. Right? Art dealer sold off parts of this. It was the high altar for the city of Siena, and it was a big to-do, and we have a lot of records, not only the contract that was given to Duccio from the cathedral, right? But also a record of when Duccio delivered this. We talked about that, like all the church bells, all the torches, right? This big parade, because the Virgin Mary, who is the centerpiece of the altarpiece, is the patron saint of the city. And all of the secondary scenes on the back, on the bottom, right, on the top, are all meant to develop in stories the life of the Virgin Mary and the life of Jesus Christ in multiple scenes, right? Giotto did this at the Arena Chapel. So remember worksheet 1, right? He had the chance in frescoes to do the same thing, 30-some scenes of the life of Christ and the Virgin, right? Duccio's doing it on a panel, on an altarpiece, rather than in fresco on the walls, right? So this was from the row of paintings on the bottom, what we call a predella, right? And we're very lucky to have it downtown, right? It's one of the most important Duccios in America, if not the most important Duccio in America, right? And a very prominent pedigree, right? Yeah, sure. Predella means that strip of paintings on the bottom, right? So when we talk about a multi-paneled altarpiece like this one, right? The different parts, right? This would be called the corpus, which is Latin for body, right? The corpus of the altarpiece. These are the pinnacles. This one top. And the predella, which is the newish term, is across the bottom, right? And most altarpieces in Italy would have had a predella and pinnacles and the centerpiece. And even the Giotto that's downtown that we looked at, right, had a series of panels rather than just one. It didn't have a corpus per se. Right? But it also had a predella at the bottom. Maybe not pinnacles on top, right? Now, not every altarpiece had a predella. So the Giotto that was just up there didn't have a predella, right? But many of them did, right? And so what happened was, after the Enlightenment, where the religion doesn't make as big a deal, right? And also during times, so the cathedral in Siena is sitting on this thing, right? And it's huge, right? The center panel is like 18 feet tall. Barely fit in through, right? Gives you a sense of scale. When they hit hard times, they sold off parts of it, even though it was so important to them, right? But now we're talking, 500 years later, and period of the Enlightenment, right? Religious less And the corpus is still there in the cathedral in Siena, in the site that it was actually commissioned to go in the first place. And so are the paintings that are on the back of the corpus. But what was sold off are the pinnacles and the predella, right? And these are scattered all over the world, right? So we have two of the predella pieces. We have this one and one from the back. And they're not front and back at the same time, right? And others we can find in other collections around the world. So this is a reconstruction, right? And in selling them off and distributing them around the world, some of the panels were actually trimmed. So if you look at the pinnacles on the top, right, one of them has that little trapezoid top. The other ones are cut down. We don't know the lost ones, right? Why they were cut down. People like split paintings, who knows, right? It seems weird to us now, right? But a lot of works that exist in museums anywhere in the world, but in particular in America, because we're kind of late to the collecting game, right, came from other works of art. They were parts of a multiple pieces together that were meant to be seen together, right? So not a vast majority, but quite a few pictures that we'll see in the next few weeks were once part of a larger ensemble of pieces, right? And that's because the work of art, to them, the work of art had a religious purpose. The whole point of the work of art was to communicate religious ideas, right? But at the same time, a work of art is a work of fine craftsmanship, right? And as such, it has material value as well as spiritual value. And that conflict between these two roles that art plays is why, what was originally intended to be seen as part of the larger work now becomes something worth some money, right? And can be sold off separately. Right? So we have not only the Annunciation scene, but we actually have, you see how those two standing figures on the sides down there? I know it's small, right? But there's two figures holding scrolls, like the Moses well, right? They're holding scrolls that roll out. They're in the National Gallery as well, right? And the rest of them include there. Right? Okay? So longish answer to your question, but an important one, because one of the things we're interested in this class is, of course, the original context of these things, right? And they're not commissioned for an art gallery. They're not painted for an art gallery. They're not painted for a museum, but that's where we see them, right? So we have to keep in mind that we're trying to locate these things in a particular time and place, right? We left off then sort of talking about Jesus in the manger and the donkey and the ox looking at him. This is called the Nativity. One of the additional readings on the online educational resources is the life of Christ in art, sort of with the terms we use for these things. But the Nativity is the birth of Christ. But again, as I mentioned, it's not the birth of Christ. It's the moment after that, right? Or even the period after that, when the infant Christ, the newborn Christ, is swaddled and laying in the manger and now receiving visitors, right? And it's one of the earliest scenes from the life of Christ. And so here is Jesus laying in the manger and the Virgin Mary looking at him in wonder in a way, right? But also, I think, with the Virgin Mary, one of the things we know from devotional literature of the early Renaissance is that the Virgin Mary knows everything. She's omniscient. And at the birth of Christ, she knows immediately his fate. She knows what's going to happen to him, right? From the get-go. And that means that she needs to do a couple of things. We talked about this, right? She needs to protect him while he's a youth and helpless. But she also needs to let it happen, even though she knows how horrible it's going to be. So she's a mother who knows her son is going to be tortured to death, and she has to let it happen. Otherwise, salvation doesn't happen, right? She has to be faithful to God's plan. And it's easy to project onto her expression some of this sort of nuanced emotion that's going on inside of her, right? One, she's got a newborn child, joy. He's the Son of God, yay, right? Other point is like, hey, this is going to turn out bad, right? It's a ticking time bomb of sadness, right? 33 years from now, right? It's going to be horrifying. And it's easy to read both in the gesture, the posture, that there's something going on that way. And that's part of that new realism. So she looks down at Jesus, and the donkey and the ox look into where they normally eat food, and there he is. And that's kind of a fascinating thing, because if you keep in mind that this was part of an altarpiece, right? So this painting, the whole big ensemble, stood behind the priest who's standing at the altar here, right? And it's behind me. Well, if you could imagine. But I'm here, I'm giving the communion, and I'm saying, here's the body of Christ, which is broken for you, and you take it and eat it. And you see behind me this picture of Christ in the tray where animals eat. And they're not going to eat him or anything, but there's still that reference to the communion, which is part of the point of the altarpiece in the first place, right? So the donkey and the ox sort of relate on one level to the performances that took place in front of the picture. Again, that understanding of the visual context. The other thing is, if we go back to early Renaissance literature, we find out that these. Did we talk about this? The symbolism of the donkey and the ox? Did we? Yeah. What's the donkey then? Who can remember? That we talked about, but the specific symbolism of the two animals?
I just remember the donkey was represented like Jewish people.
That's right. Okay, good. We did go over that, right? Donkeys are stubborn, and so anti-Semitic early Renaissance theologians said that the donkey is a symbol for the Jews because they have heard the message of the Messiah, but they refuse to recognize it. And oxen do what they're told, right? And they then represented the Gentiles. Right, the Christian. And so together, the donkey and the oxen refer to sort of all of the world, those who reject Christ and those who accept him. Right? And Islam didn't really enter into it yet. Right? Contact with the East in Italy at this point is not that strong. Later on, we'll see more of that kind of rear up. I don't know if it actually comes up in this class very much. So good. Thank you, Gabriel. That's perfect. I wanted to point to a couple things. One is, here's an earlier mosaic of exactly the same scene. This is in a monastery in Greece, right? A Byzantine monastery in Greece. And they talked about the influence of Byzantine art on Italian art, right? A week ago, or maybe in the online lecture. But there we have the Nativity as well in this sort of half dome in the corner of this church. And you can see how many of the motifs that were established centuries before reappear here. And this is an important element of looking at, particularly religious art from the Renaissance, is the degree to which it's very conventional. That the artists are following sort of established visual traditions and not mucking around with them too much, right? So we have the donkey and the ox looking down at Christ in the manger. She's got her hands on his head, which is different. But there's the Virgin Mary right next to him, sitting on that red pad, which you may not notice at first. All of a sudden she's on the blob, you know? Looks like a big beanbag chair, right? That sort of offsets the blue of her robe. We have the figures in the lower right corner with the sheep. We have the angels up above. We have the man on the left kneeling off her elbow, right? It's just a lot of things it's not coincidence, right? Duccio is taking established visual traditions and sort of updating them, right? With this new style that's more three-dimensional. It's flat, right? So it's an important thing to remember that where the innovation comes and where it doesn't come. And again, our artists are working on commission, and they're trying to please the patron, and part of that pleasure would come from really relying on traditional works, right? And again, we think about the difference in how we appreciate art now in the 21st century versus in the 14th century. We appreciate innovation and originality. That's what we think is some of the most important things about art. But in the 14th century, in the early Renaissance, often these sorts of traditions that Duccio is using makes the work more valuable. As a religious work, right? That dual thing that we were talking about, right? As a religious work, it becomes more effective when it's conventional, right? Insofar as the subject matter is concerned. And part of that is you don't want to make people guess, right? You don't, I don't get it, right? If it's conventional, then it's easy to read. And for Christians, right, one of the things that we find as a tradition going way back is that images are intended to communicate in the same way that words do. And many people from the church, from the Catholic Church, would argue at numerous times in history that actually it's better than words, because most people can't read. And images are the Bible of the illiterate, right? And in addition to that, if we think about a Mass ceremony, you're going in for communion, the Mass was performed in Latin, not in the language that people spoke. So it too is somewhat unintelligible. But images are intelligible. Images you can understand, right? And that's part of the reason for this reliance on convention. Who's that in the pink? Who do you suppose the man is off to her right, off to your left? This is the birth of Christ. So the woman in blue is obviously the Virgin Mary. Anybody know enough about religion to guess who the old man on the left is? It's her husband. What's his name? Joseph. Very good. St. Joseph, right? Or Joseph. That's her husband. You notice the age difference, right? That's accounted for in the Bible. She was like 14, right? And he was significantly older. But it tends to be sort of played up in early Renaissance imagery, in part to show that he's not Jesus' real dad, right? He's his stepdad. And the age difference is to show that he is, pre-Viagra, right? He's not Jesus' biological father, right? And you'll notice he's sort of separated from her. There's that visual break with the edge of the shed that goes between them, and he's kind of outside the manger shed. She's inside. This separates him, right? That keeps them apart from each other, right? So it's St. Joseph, and he's looking in, and part of it is that he's slowly aware of what's going on, right? He's been visited by an angel. When she gets pregnant, an angel goes to Joseph, the Bible tells us, and tells him, like, she's not been cheating on you, right? That which is in her was given by the Holy Spirit, he says, right? So after she gets pregnant, of course, Joseph goes, I haven't slept with her. What's going on? And an angel tells him, don't worry, it's a miracle, right? And he believes it, because it's true. I can say that here. It's a Catholic institution, right? So there's Joseph, older, not dad, stepdad, not father, separated, right? Not biological father. Who are those guys in the right corner? Shepherds, right? Think Linus in the Charlie Brown Christmas, right? When he gets the spotlight. Yo, there were shepherds in the fields, right? And there they are, the shepherds in the fields, who are the first people to visit Jesus. So what we have here is a sort of multiple scenes in one frame, right? So here are the shepherds hearing from the angel that Jesus has been born. The angel appears to them, gestures toward the manger. There he is. Go see the Messiah, right? Go see the Savior. And we know they're shepherds because of the sheep, cute little puppy dog, right? Sheepdog. But also their clothing, which, as you can see, is a little tattered. And also they carry musical instruments. And this isn't really in the Bible, but it appeared in religious dramas through the Middle Ages, which were staged in cities everywhere, that sort of translated the shepherds into musicians. So they carry bagpipes, right? And we often see them with that. So they've got them there as well. And they're listening to the angel, and she's telling them, go over there and see Jesus. Notice the scale difference, right? How small they are compared to the Virgin Mary and Joseph. The artist for all of the chiaroscuro three-dimensionality is still using what we call a hieratic scale. Important things are bigger, which is not particularly realistic, right? For us, bigger things are closer, right? Perspective, right? So the people in the back row are smaller than the people up front in my frame of vision. But in this case, the shepherds are smaller because they're less important, right? That will begin to change, and we'll start to see works of art that are much more realistically scaled in space, right? Proportion. But in this case, they're out of proportion, right? Good. So we have the shepherds on the right, and little things that can identify them. The figures in the front are a little bit more difficult because they're not actually mentioned in the Bible. This is Jesus' second time. So again, we have multiple scenes within one frame, right? So we have actually Jesus appearing twice. And this is the baby Jesus being attended by two midwives, right? Two women attendants to the Virgin Mary. And of course, they're less important, so they're smaller, but we make Jesus smaller here just to make him fit within that little vignette, right? And they are now washing Christ after the birth. And they're not mentioned in the Bible, but they're mentioned in a lot of these other early Renaissance sources. Remember how we talked about how the Franciscans and the Dominicans are sort of developing the story to make it more realistic, right? And that's part of the realism that Giotto and Duccio have. Well, in addition to that, they would elaborate on the stories and tell them, why is this relevant to you? How does this match up with the kind of experience you have in your life? Right? How do these real people at this time have an experience that was similar to yours? And they would envelop the stories with things that aren't in the Bible but would make some sense. And one of them would be that the Virgin Mary would, like women in the 14th century, have attendants at the birth of Christ. So we have the midwives now washing Jesus a second time. So Christ appears twice within this image, right? It's a continuous narrative, right? In one scene, we have multiple time frames. And in this case, we kind of have three different ones. The birth of Christ, the shepherds being told about the birth of Christ, and we have this scene of the midwives, all appearing within a single frame, right? And that's pretty common in early Renaissance art, to find that multiplicity of scenes within a single frame, right? That's what we're seeing here. The last thing I wanted to point to, I'm sorry this is a little bit more blurry than it looked like on the small screen, is while Giotto and Duccio are both developing a very three-dimensional approach to art, you would never really confuse a Giotto with a Duccio because the style looks different. The way they structure the face looks different. The way they handle things like hands looks different. Each one of them has, there's a style that's relevant to most painters of the period, that new interest in realism and three-dimensionality. That's shared. But within that, there are nuances of personal style that each artist has. And Giotto's is boxier. The bodies are sort of boxier. I always get a feeling that you could carve a Giotto head out of a milk carton. The Virgin Mary's eyes are more of an almond shape and sort of linear. You can almost draw a line straight across her eyes. The bodies are a little bit burlier, thicker, right? Duccio is significantly more delicate and refined and kind of porcelain-like. The fingers of the Virgin Mary are much more thin and elongated. Her face doesn't have that milk box quality. There's something dainty and delicate and refined and actually more beautiful about it. There's something about a line that Duccio likes. If we look at the edge of the Virgin Mary's robe, you can see there's that delicate gold line, sort of a filigree-like calligraphy that really defines a lot of what he does. Look at the two Jesus figures and their faces, right? Giotto's just is sort of manlier, There's something more dainty about Duccio's works, right? And so there is a sort of personal style that each of these two artists have, an individual way of developing this new Renaissance interest in three-dimensional works. Right? Now, Duccio working in Siena had pupils. The way that you learned art, did we talk about this in the Renaissance? Right? Okay, I've got three different classes. Today, if you want to study art, you become an art major at a university, right? You're doing interior design as a master's degree. You go to school for this sort of thing, right? But in the Middle Ages, there were universities going back to the 11th, 12th century, but they primarily taught clergy and they primarily taught like philosophy and religion, with the law, right? But not art. Art was not a major. The only way you would learn art or any kind of craft-based you would find an established master, your family would pay them, and you would go work for them, and you would twofold. The guy would get some money, but in addition to that, you would get a studio assistant, right, and work with you. And that's the way you learn, was through apprenticeship. In the same way, Marriott, we make you all do an internship, right? So this, but not exactly the same, right? So an internship was usually about 3 years, right, of fairly intense work, and you would do all the grunt stuff, right? So you'd be the one that was mixing paints. Did we talk about mixing paints in this class, right? Where you would go to the chemist and you would buy the ground up material that would be what's called a pigment that you would then mix into the egg yolks to make tempera paint, right? And the raw matter was sold by a chemist, right? So ground up stones, ground up plants, ground up bugs, pieces of metal that make these different forms. So, like white comes from metal, right? Do you ever look at your car battery, the lead on the holes in your car battery, pick up this sort of white stuff that grows on it? That's why we call it lead white, right? It comes off of lead. Green comes from copper. Blue comes from lapis lazuli, turquoise, right? Turquoise from lapis lazuli came from Turkey. It's turquoise. It's from Turkey, right? Red comes from beetles, right? Yellows from daffodils. Right? You can grind stuff up, and the chemist would do this for you, and he would sell it to you in a big jar full of powder, right? And you would take that back to your studio and would mix it in with whatever you're going to use to make it stick to the canvas or the hammer, right? But that's kind of a pain job, right? So the apprentice would learn that. They would learn everything that they needed to know to go out on their own. How to grind the pigment, how to mix it into the egg yolks for tempera or later oil paint, how to buy boards from the guy that's sawing them up and join them together to make the size that you need, how to sand it and cover it with the sealing agent, the gesso. Right? That's all the stuff you would learn as an apprentice. And sometimes you would even help the master, with some of the mundane details off in the corner. You paint that flower, right? Then you'll learn by doing it. Okay? Simone Martini was an apprentice under Duccio. Okay? That's why I'm going into all of this. This is how Simone Martini learned to paint. Was he apprenticed under Duccio in Siena? Giotto had a ton of apprentices as well. We just didn't look at any of them. Okay? This is why Simone Martini's Virgin looks an awful lot like Duccio's Virgin. Because that's where he learned how to paint. Right? And his style follows pretty closely on Duccio's. Furthermore, Duccio had the high altar in Siena. And that meant people in Siena liked that style and wanted paintings that looked like it. So it makes sense that Simone's would look like it because that's what the market demanded. Right? Look like Duccio. Okay? So we can explain a certain similarity, this daintiness I was just talking about with Duccio's work, reappearing in Simone's work because of this context for which it was painted. Right? Now, more particularly with this context, Duccio's Maestà altarpiece was on the high altar. This is a ground plan of the cathedral in Siena. Okay? And the doorway is here. There's a dome over the center. The priest would stand basically here, right? The congregation here. And the main altar, the Maestà, was there, visible from the front door. So this is why the size is so important. Once that was installed, they commissioned altarpieces to go on either side of it. Okay, there were 4 more altarpieces commissioned to flank the Maestà altar by Duccio. And one of them was this one. So it was originally seen in context with the Maestà. This also accounts for the similarity of style, right? You want these things to look like a suite, right? Like a unit. And so he follows Duccio's style very, very closely. And it's placed in this side altar next to the Maestà. Right? So this is, again, our original context for this piece. Now, what Simone Martini illustrates is just one scene from the life of the Virgin Mary and also the life of Jesus Christ. And each of the 4 altars that were flanking this took another scene from the life of the Virgin Mary, right? And 3 of them still survive. One of them's gone, right? So Simone Martini picks this image, and the focus remains the Virgin Mary, right? Even though this is how Christ came into being, right? So again, the life of Christ, the Annunciation, is the moment when the angel announces to the Virgin Mary that she will be the mother of God, right? She will be the mother of the Savior, right? And theologically speaking, the way the miracle takes place is through the Virgin listening. When she hears the words of the angel, she is miraculously impregnated, right? In lieu of intercourse. And this is why Joseph, right, is off to the side in that nativity scene, okay? So this is the moment of the incarnation, right? Christ becoming bodily in the womb of the Virgin Mary. And the angel comes in from the left. The angel always comes in from the left in Annunciation scenes. 99 out of 100 images of the Annunciation have the angel coming in from the left. And the few where the angel comes in for the right can be explained by where it was originally seen, right? But 99 times out of 100 it comes in from the left. And he kneels in front of the Virgin Mary, the angel does, and he points up to heaven where, surrounded by angels, we see the dove of the Holy Spirit coming down with rays of light, the forehead of the Virgin Mary. Yeah.
What's the significance of always coming in from the left?
Yeah. Good question. There's a left and right priority in a lot of Renaissance and medieval art, and it's usually stage left and stage right. Okay? So, in many images, you'll see the Virgin on your left when someone less significant from her is on your right, because it's stage left and stage right. And the idea is that God is looking at us, and it's His right way. Okay, so right is better than left. Okay, that's why we say right for correct. And in fact, the Latin word for left was sinistra, sinister. Right? Left and right sides are given as a priority to the right side. It's not saying that the left is always bad. Okay? So in this case, since the angel's coming directly from heaven, it gets the right hand side. Whereas the Virgin is on earth and she gets left hand side. Even though she's the most important woman in the world, right? She's still in the world. Angels from heaven, thus coming in from the left. That's as good a guess. And by the way, that's kind of a guess. Right? But it's based on things that I right? There's a couple of articles out there on the 1 or 2 different images where the angel comes in from the right instead. And I've had to go back and read those to figure out why it's wrong. That's my educated guess. Right? Now, the images of the Annunciation are fairly traditional again, right? This is like we saw with the Nativity. There is a legacy to these things. There's a visual convention of the angel coming in from the left, and there's certain things that are quite conventional. So this is a English or Norman prayer book, a Psalter, book of Psalms, that has at the beginning of it something like 12 images of the life of the Virgin Christ, but it predates this by 250 years or so, right? Maybe even as much as 300 years. And there's the angel gesturing again, right? And the Virgin Mary seated again. And you'll also notice other similarities. She's got a book in both of them, right? She's been reading. And that's an interesting element of this, because that, coupled with the sort of elegance of where she's seated in both of them, it's kind of a swanky chair, right? It's got a canopy in the St. Edmund's Psalter, right? A cushion underneath. It looks like a throne. And Simone gives us this wonderful inlaid, marble inlaid throne with that great piece of cloth I have a detail to show you. And also very throne-like. This elevates her status, right? So even though she's not from heaven, she's important, right? The throne. Ditto the book. Because, you guys can all read, you're literate, but literacy rates in the 14th century were very, very low, and they were gender-based. right? Women, very few people read in the first place, and even fewer women could. So the fact that the Virgin Mary is reading, seated on that throne, is a way of elevating her status, right? She's the first among women. She can do things other women can't. In addition to that, the idea that the angel is coming in as she's been reading is also almost as if he's an answer to prayer. That she's been reading her Bible. It's not just any book, right? It's not Vogue magazine or something. She's been reading a devotional text. And because of that focus, heaven is opened up to her. Right? So there's that part of the message as well. That maybe you, through your prayers and devotion, might also have some miraculous experience that hopefully doesn't end in pregnancy. Right? But some sort of miraculous experience. So the book has a sort of a prominent resonance for this image about sort of what's going on with it, right? As the angel comes in, you'll notice he's pointing upward to the dove of the Holy Spirit up above. A couple of things I wanted to point out here. First, he's carrying a laurel branch. And symbolically, laurel is, bay leaves, right? Is a symbol of peace. And in fact, in poetry, you'll find that someone says, I come bearing a laurel branch, means I come to sort of try to iron it out. Would that the president and the Senate would come bearing a laurel branch, right, to iron things out. So the angel's message is one of peace, right? Jesus is coming to bring peace to the earth from a theological standpoint. The other thing I wanted to point to with the angel is the clothing, right? And if you look closely at this detail, and again, remember this is a very large painting, right? If you look closely at this detail, you can see how that beautiful fabric, that the sort of gold white fabric that the angel's wearing with that wonderful sort of floral pattern over it. Or I always think it looks like Burberry lining in the cape, right? This is swanky textiles. And in fact, the city of Siena, where Simone Martini is working, where Duccio worked, was a textile center. Right? And one of the major industries in Siena was trading in fabric. Right? And so this almost as if this is fine-tuned to meet local tastes. Right? It's a style center. And there is this interest in brocading in this work that fits the context of the piece. The other flower that we can see here that didn't appear in the earlier work is a lily. Potted lily that's right between the angel and Mary. And the lily is one of many flowers that was a symbol for the Virgin Mary. So we looked at Giotto. We talked about the fact that the rose is a symbol of the Virgin Mary, right? And because it's a fragrant, soft flower that comes from a spiny thorn, right? Or a thorny branch. And that theologians saw the thorny branch, this is the Giotto picture, the thorny branch is the legacy of Eve, which is sin, thus the thorns. And the flower is the Virgin Mary that comes from the thorny branch but isn't thorny and is in fact itself fragrant. The lily was also seen as a symbol for the Virgin Mary. For numbers of reasons. One, of course, is that it's white as a symbol of purity. The other is that it was believed to be the tallest flower. It's not, but that's what they say. Right? And as the tallest flower, that matched the Virgin being the greatest of women. Right? So the lily becomes a symbol for the Virgin Mary, and it's here. And they gave numerous other reasons I don't want to get into. Right? So it's here as a symbol for her. Right? You'll also notice in front of the flower there are letters. Can you see that going across the surface? So part of the background has been raised up, built up. Right? We talked about how the gold leaf is applied. There's this clay underneath it that they polish, and the gold leaf sticks to that clay. Well, parts of that gold leaf parts of the clay background have been built up in 3 dimensions, and then the gold leaf laid over the top of it. And those are the words of the angel in Latin from the Bible when the angel announces to Mary that she will bear Christ. And what he says is, behold, or hail, Mary, right, implied, full of the grace of God, or full of grace, God is with you. Right? And this is Ave, hail, gratia plena, right? Full of grace. Plena, full, gratia, grace. Domini, ipsi Deum, God is with you. Dominus Tecum. Right? Those are the angel's words. And they go directly from the angel's lips on the left to the virgin's ear on the right. Right? There's a beeline. And if you look at the image on the right, you can barely see the upraised letters continuing all the way to the ear of the virgin as she cocks her head to listen. Right? So this is that moment of annunciation. Third detail, the Virgin Mary. More of this interest in sumptuous fabrics, right? And there's the last of the words tecum, right? Coming right toward her ear. When we looked at Duccio, we talked about expressions, facial expressions, and the idea of trying to enliven scenes by making them more human. What would you say about that expression? What is her reaction to this message? No wrong answers here. She doesn't look pleased. What would you say, Katrina, if some guy came into your room in the middle of the night and said, hey, I'm going to make you pregnant with the Son of God? There's kind of a human reaction to this. Like, say what? Right? Amber says what? It's like, I don't get this. And in fact, one of that kind of humanizing of the story fits with what we know from, again, non-biblical sources, right? There are these other ways that people got insights into religion. And we talked before about the two midwives being in sort of religious dramas that were performed in the streets. Well, one of these is a drama of the Annunciation, and the script of the drama tells us that the Virgin went through 3 stages of reaction, right? And the first stage was this natural skepticism, like, And then she thought about it, she reflected on the message, and then she complied. Then she said, sure, right? Then she said, I am a servant. I will do what you say, which was her response to the angel. Behold, the handmaiden of God, right? I am his servant. So what we have here with Simone is the first of that elaborate reaction. The kind of moment, say what? Right before she actually reacts, there's a skepticism almost to it. And again, that's part of the new realism that we're seeing as we look at early Renaissance art, is this interest in realism. Now, we've got a much smaller Simone Martini in the National Gallery. I think that if you were to put these side by side, it would be about that tall, right, next to it. But art history lies to you and we make everything the same size, right? These are all 6.6 inches tall on my PowerPoint, right? And therefore the same size here. And you can see that it's very, very similar in style to the angel in the Annunciation. So this is the Annunciate angel. And again, made for the market in Siena, made to meet those tastes. The brocading on the fabric is really quite wonderful. It's a bit beat up, right? But it's a fairly important work. And originally, this was made for private use, and there were 2 panels that were hinged together, right? And it's only about like this big, right? I mean, it's really small. And it was meant for private use. Somebody bought it from Simone and said, I want an Annunciation, but I want you to put it on 2 folding panels that I can carry around with me and use for my private prayers, right? So you have to imagine with a work that is almost the same size as if you were to fold your piece of paper in half. It's this big, right? And that's something that you could either put on your mantelpiece, right, or carry with you in a backpack, right, and bring out when you want to, and then you can focus your prayers, and it can become, for you, what the book was for the Virgin Mary. Right, inroad to a heightened awareness, right, a spiritual awareness. So we're very fortunate to have a Simone Martini downtown, and it looks as if the composition of the angel is very similar to what he used for the altarpiece, and that would make some sense, because these altarpieces in the cathedral would have established the tastes for people who were buying works of art. I want something that looks like that made it more valuable. Now, Simone Martini ends up being very, very important for the history of art, because in 1340, Simone Martini moved from Siena to France. Right? He moved to the city of Avignon, and right around 1340, and he sets up his shop there. Spends the rest of his career working in Avignon. Does anybody know anything about the city of Avignon and why Simone Martini might have wanted to go here in the 14th century, in the 1340s? From a history class. Do you know what was going on in France in the 14th century? No? It's all right. The Papal Schism. So in 1300, this is one of my favorite historical stories. I don't have time to go through it. You couldn't make this sort of stuff up. The bottom line is that in 1309, the King of France was able to get the Pope in Rome expelled from the city of Rome and have his own hand-picked Pope replace him. 1309. Right? And it's all about power and money. Right? It has to do with the Pope not doing the things that the King of France wanted him to do, sort of rebelling against him, but also had to do with the Knights Templar, if that makes any sense, Dan Brown sort of things. Money being collected from pilgrims going to Jerusalem. The king wants part of that to take. He's going to shut down the Knights Templar, going to shut down the papacy, pick his own Pope that will do what he wants. Right? And this is all in 1309. The Pope then, in allegiance to the King of France, moves from Rome to the city of Avignon in the south of France. There is a papal palace in Avignon. Right? It's no longer inhabited. You can go see it. Right? Sure. From 1309 onward. Right? And there remains this hand-picked French Pope living in Avignon through most of the 14th century. Doesn't move back, the Pope doesn't move back and become independent from France until the 15th century, until the 1400s, right? And this is part of the reason why the Renaissance starts in these merchant cities instead, right? Papacy's not in Rome. Right? So, Simone Martini is moving to Avignon because there is money to be made in Avignon for a painter. Because the papacy is there. The papacy is surrounded by bankers, because they're involved in international trade. There are merchants in Avignon. There's a huge market for art in Avignon. And Simone Martini is going there to capitalize on the market. And so this kind of art, this new realism, and this particularly elegant version of it that came out at Duccio, Simone Martini starts making works exactly like that in Avignon. Right? So while Giotto and Duccio get this new style started, it's Simone Martini who spreads it. And it becomes international. We start to see this new Italian style of art everywhere in Europe, starting with Avignon. Starting with works that were done in the circle of the Pope. From there, it spreads to the French king. Right? The French king is married to everybody in Europe. Right? Nieces, cousins, etc. In almost every country in Europe. So they see what's going on. Ooh, new style. Elegant, beautiful, expensive looking, and realistic. I want some of that stuff too. And all of a sudden, what started in Florence and Siena goes to Avignon first, goes to Paris after that, and from Paris, it's in Germany, it's in the Low Countries, it's in England, it's in Spain. Right? It's everywhere. From this point forward. And the reason it's everywhere is because of Simone Martini. Right? Because he decides to practice his trade that he had learned in Siena under Duccio. He decides to practice his trade in Avignon. And that spreads the style. Right? So here's a work of art that was done in the Low Countries. Right? It's done in modern Belgium. Okay? And it's another Annunciation scene, the same scene we had before. You can see the conventions, right? that are here, that have been spread by Simone Martini, but also very conventional. Angel coming in from the left, right? Saying the words to the Virgin Mary. Virgin Mary on a very elaborate throne on the right. Right? Got a book again. She's not holding it, but she's got a book in front of her. Right? We still have that gold background, that old Byzantine gold background, but these sumptuous colors, sort of elegant refinement, a sort of calligraphy to the edge of the hem, right? Bright colors, dainty figures, right? Porcelain-like features. All of that's coming out of Simone Martini and has spread via Avignon to other places in Europe. And in this particular case, this work we know was made for the Duke of Burgundy. Now, worksheet 2, we talked about the Duke of Burgundy, Duke Philip the Bold of Burgundy, right? So the Klaus Sluter PowerPoint talks about this guy. This work was made for him as well, right? And he's a major collector of the arts. Here's a portrait of him in Dijon, in the museum in Dijon. He's the one who paid for whoever this artist was on the left for this work. And it's up in the Walters Museum in Baltimore, which is not closed down by the government shutdown and is free to the public. So you get your stuff. I was in Baltimore on Sunday, right, at the Walters. But this is up there, right? Philip the Bold commissioned this work, right? Philip the Bold was the uncle of the King of France, right? He had received his title as Duke of Burgundy from his older brother, who was the previous King of France, right? So he's related directly to the French throne, and this is why this sort of Siena version of New Realism spreads to the Low Countries, right? Politics, similar style among politics. So there's the angel, lots of similarities, right? Again, angel from the left, virgin seated on the throne, right? A somewhat different reaction. In this case, more reflective, perhaps. Maybe even with her hands crossed over her breast like that, she is now submitting. Right? Bowing in humility to the message, rather than that stark, surprised reaction that we saw with Simone's work. Still a great interest in sort of elaborate, beautiful fabrics, probably directly out of the influence of Simone Martini. Because it's a smaller panel, they're crowded more closely together. We don't get the lily anymore. In fact, we don't even have the laurel branch. Little things are manipulable, right? You can switch things around. But the general tenor remains very much the same. In each of them, they have rather tropical wings. That was a way for artists in Italy and France to show that this is coming from extraordinary place, right? The wings of the angel. And what our artist has done is to change a few things around, right? In addition to omitting some things, the words of the angel are no longer sort of hanging in air, but are now on a scroll that the angel actually holds in its hand. It's part of the three-dimensional quality of the image, is this scroll with the words, Ave Gratia Plena Dominus Tecum, right? Behold, or hail full of grace, God is with you. And then it comes down here, and it's just beautifully decorated at the bottom. One of the things we see as we move into, this spread, right, from Siena elsewhere. We call this the International Gothic style, right? Because it's this late Gothic, early Renaissance style that began in Florence and Siena. It's now spreading everywhere, becoming international. It's not a term that Simone Martini would have used. It's not a term that the artist on the left would have used. It's a historical term for this spread that was begun by Simone Martini, International Gothic style. Now, some details. This panel is pretty small. It's about like this, because like the Simone Martini diptych, it was meant for sort of personal use, right? And it could, again, we'll see its multiple panels could be folded up. A lot more detail. And there seems to be a great heightened interest as we move into the 15th century, particularly in Northern Europe, a heightened interest in realistic detail. That had been begun with Giotto and Duccio, but it increases. Look at that throne. Becomes this bit of architecture, right? complete with ceiling tiles, carved wooden open work behind the fabric, these wonderful stone canopy around the top where the artist is depicting all of these sort of unnecessary details. But that seems to be something we find a lot in works of art that came from artists in the Low Countries, in what is today Belgium and Holland. The words, as we saw there, coming from the angel as a physical object held as part of the picture rather than as supernaturally imposed on the background. Because her reaction is different, it's a different moment in the story, and it's the moment when she responds. I am a handmaiden of God. Behold the handmaiden of God, right? I am just a servant. And her words, behold the handmaiden of God, are written on her book. Ecce ancilla Domini. Left page, Ecce ancilla Domini on the right page, right? Behold the handmaiden of God. So her words are also included on this. The point of the picture is to talk about this dialogue, right, between the two of them as it tells the story. So angel comes in with his words. Her words actually are inscribed on her book, right? It's almost like the Bible's telling her what to do, telling her how to behave, how to react to this. God's got a book up above instead of having the Holy Spirit. Well, the Holy Spirit is there, but between God and the Virgin Mary. God is up above with a book, and you can see his book also has words that we're meant to be able to read. Alpha et O, the Alpha and Omega. This is a reference to Jesus. He's the beginning and the end. Alpha, the first letter in the Greek alphabet, and Omega, the last, right? He's the A and the Z, right? And God is saying that as he's gesturing toward the Virgin Mary from heaven up above as well, right? So, some things very similar, very traditional as this international Gothic style spreads, and then some little bits that are somewhat different and a greater increase in smaller details, which is something we'll see as a trend. And if you've done the Klaus Sluter worksheet, we see it in sculpture as well, increasing amount of detail. Now, this work was also part of a larger ensemble, right? It was part of a multi-paneled work that has since been cut up. And what it was hinged. There were 4 panels that went together, and they were hinged and sort of folded together like a Chinese screen. And the term we use for this is polyptych. So we saw 2 of them, diptych, right? Like the Simone work that was in the National Gallery, diptych. Di, 2. Ptych is Greek for wing, 2 wings, right? Polyptych, many wings. Anything more than 3. Right? And so there were hinges originally between the different parts, and 2 of them were sold off in Baltimore. Both of these are in Baltimore. And 2 of them are in Antwerp, right? In Belgium. And the sequencing is off. They sold us number 1 and number 3. Right? So originally the sequencing would have started with the Annunciation, Nativity, midwife, Joseph, right? Then we would have the crucifixion, and then we would have Christ rising from the grave, right? So we get 1 and 3 out of the sequence. And there's some question about how it all eventually went together, because 2 of the panels are painted on the outside as well. And so as it folded up, you would see something on the outside of it too. And there we have Christ being baptized and St. Christopher on the right. So it was this elaborate work of 4 panels, 2 of which were painted front and back, right? That would then fold up into a sort of pocket version that you could carry with you. And Philip the Bold kept this through his life, probably traveled with it as he moved through his realm. And at the end of his life, he donated it to the monastery where the Moses well is, right? Which is where he had hoped to retire. Okay? So this was from the same patron, and here's a schematic of how it might have worked, right? You flip it open, you flip it open, you flip it open, you get a sense of how it all lays out, right? So it's a private work for private use, just like the little Simone in the National Gallery. Looking at the other scene, we have Christ on the cross, right? The crucifixion. Again, words are important. right? Christ speaks, and there's a scroll that kind of comes up from behind his head. These are his last words as he's dying on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, right? And down below on either side, we have figures who were there at the crucifixion. Who do you suppose that is on the left? Mary, the Virgin Mary's mother. She's weeping. She's watching her son die. There's an interest in trying to get the emotion of the scene. She's part of her robe up to her face, right? On the right is St. John, who always appears there. Here now, Katrina, right, she gets the right-hand side because she's more important than St. John, right? There's that right-left distinction. And it's not that John is bad, he's just less important, right? And by the way, when Jesus is crucified between two thieves, one of them converts and the other one refuses to. One recognizes Christ, and he's always depicted on Christ's right, whereas the bad thief is on his left. Right? So there is, in looking at pictures, an arrangement that is usually followed. So John, while he's important, is less important than the Virgin Mary. And thus, he gets your right or stage left. Right? So Virgin and John on either side. We have angels around Christ. And you'll notice again that hieratic scale. They're significantly smaller than Jesus to fit them in. Otherwise, it would be awfully crowded. Up above, God, ego sum via veritas. What is that? I am the way, the truth, and the light, referring to Christ. The INRI, Latin, Iesu, Jesus, Nazareti, of Nazareth, Rex Iudi, King of the Jews. Right? This is what was placed on his cross. And there are his words now coming out of that banner from his mouth. Last thing we'll look at are these angels that appear around, and I like the rocket trail of the angel coming in from the left, jet-powered angel. And you can see there's one by his hand, one by his side, another one down at his feet. And can you see what they're doing? It's a little difficult, but each one of them has a chalice in their hand, a cup. Can you see that? And the cup is only big, kind of traced into the background, but you can see there's the top of the cup, right? There's the stem down to here. This one's a little bit easier to see. And down at the foot of the cross, it's even easier because it silhouettes against the cross. And the angels are gathering the blood of Christ in these cups. What's up with that? Any Catholics out there? What's up with gathering the blood of Christ in a cup? Communion. It's the Christian communion, right? When you go to, during Mass, you receive from the priest bread and wine. And the priest blesses both of these. And in Catholic theology, a miracle happens. They both become more than just symbols. They truly become the body and blood of Christ. That you partake in becomes part of you. That's the technology, right? So we've talked about the manger relating to the body of Christ, right? Here, the blood of Christ is being gathered. So you remember when you partake that the blood of Christ is gathered in the chalice. In addition to that, there were numerous places in Europe, and in fact in the Low Countries, there's a really famous one, Bruges, where they actually had relics of the blood of Christ that they could trace back for over 1,000 years that had been in the possession of the church that was believed to be the blood of Christ. And so this adds to the reality, the truthfulness of these relics as well, right? That have been collected and stored in churches. So we have in both the Annunciation, Nativity, and the Crucifixion, elements that relate to sort of religious practices, right? In one way or another. And this was part of that work that was owned by Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy. Okay, so 9:15. We'll pick up with this, International Gothic. We'll wrap that up and move on to 15th century Netherlandish art, late Gothic stuff. So I'll be now taking the next set of OERs today. If you want to read ahead, they'll be up there, and I'll send you an email when I get those up. Right. And Claudia, if we can just a second before you take off. And if you turn on one of the lights, that's great.